Emily Carter passed away at 3:47 p.m. on an ordinary Tuesday in November. At that very moment, Richard Sterling, one of the wealthiest men in the United States, was in a business meeting worth $200 million. But when he felt that sharp pain in his chest, that inexplicable ache that made him knock over his water glass, he knew. He knew before the phone rang. He knew before anyone could tell him. He knew. The same way he knew so many things about that woman, who had only been his housekeeper for 6 months. If you've ever felt you were about to lose someone, before even knowing something was wrong, then you'll understand what happened in that boardroom. Richard Sterling abandoned everything. He left the Japanese investors waiting. He left $200 million on the table, and he ran. He ran as if his life depended on it, because, somehow, he knew it did. The Sterling estate was a 40-minute drive from the financial district of New York City. Richard made the trip in 18. As his car skidded on the gravel driveway, he could already see the ambulance. Emily was on the kitchen floor. Lily, his 4-year-old daughter, was next to her, holding her hand, repeating softly something that made Richard freeze in his tracks. "Come back, Mommy. You promised. This time we were going to stay together." Those words didn't make sense. Or they made too much sense. The paramedics worked frantically. One of them looked at Richard and uttered the words no one ever wants to hear. "She's not responding. We need to get her there. Now." Richard climbed into the ambulance without asking permission. No one dared to stop him. He held Emily's hand. That hand he had avoided touching for the past 6 months. That hand that made his heart race in a way he couldn't explain. And as their fingers intertwined, it happened. A spark. Not metaphorical. Literal. A surge that made the monitors flicker. The paramedic looked startled. "Sir, did you feel that?" Richard didn't answer, because in that moment, for a fraction of a second, he saw Emily in another place and in another time, wearing a dress from another era, dying in his arms, and he heard his own voice, but it wasn't his voice, saying, "No, not again. Please." The vision lasted less than a second, but it changed everything. The hospital was 10 minutes away. They were the longest 10 minutes of Richard's life. He didn't let go of Emily's hand. He couldn't. It was as if an invisible force kept them connected. The paramedic monitored her vitals with an increasingly grim expression. "Her heart is failing. We need to get there soon." Richard looked at Emily's face. Pale. Serene. Almost as if she were sleeping. But he knew it wasn't sleep. He knew that face. He knew it from dreams he'd had since childhood. He knew it from a feeling he could never explain. He knew it from a place that his rational mind insisted didn't exist. "Who were you?" he whispered softly, hoping no one would hear. "Who were we?" Emily didn't answer. Her heart stopped for the first time just as the ambulance crossed the hospital gates. Doctors rushed to meet the gurney. Richard was pushed aside. Someone shouted, "Code Blue!" Doors opened and slammed shut, and he stood there, in the hallway, his hand still tingling from her touch. That's when Mrs. Eleanor arrived, the 75-year-old housekeeper who had worked for the Sterling family for half a century. She held little Lily in her arms, and her eyes, when they met Richard's, carried a weight he had never seen before. "It's finally happened," she said, her voice trembling. "After all these years, it's finally happened." "What are you talking about, Eleanor?" Richard asked, angry, confused, desperate. But before the old woman could answer, a doctor appeared in the emergency room doors. "Mr. Sterling, the patient has gone into cardiac arrest. We're doing everything we can, but I need you to know, the chances are slim." Richard felt the world spin. Slim. The word echoed in his head like a funeral bell. He had lost his wife 5 years ago in a car accident. He had sworn never to fall in love again, He had built walls around his heart so high that no one could climb them. And then Emily Carter came to work at his house. A housekeeper, a single mother, a woman who had nothing to do with his world of billions and international business. But from the first moment he saw her, Richard knew she was different. There was something in her eyes, something familiar, something ancient. When she smiled, he felt a joy he hadn't experienced in decades. When she cried, he felt a pain that wasn't his own. And for the past 6 months, he had fought against that connection with all his might, because it didn't make sense, because it was insane, because he was a businessman, a practical man, a man who didn't believe in destiny or soulmates or any romantic nonsense. But now, standing in that hospital hallway, with the tingle of her touch still in his hand, Richard finally understood. He wasn't going crazy. He was remembering. "Mr. Sterling," Mrs. Eleanor's voice brought him back. "There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Richard looked at the old housekeeper. For the first time, he noticed how she was trembling, how her eyes were filled with tears, how she seemed to carry the weight of decades of silence. "What is it, Eleanor? What do you know?" The old woman took a deep breath. "I knew your great-grandfather, sir, Mr. Edward Sterling. He told me a story before he died. A story about his great-great-grandfather, about a woman he loved, about a promise made in 1820. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. 1820. Exactly 200 years ago. "Continue," he said, his voice barely a whisper. But before Mrs. Eleanor could speak further, the emergency room doors opened again. The doctor was pale. "Mr. Sterling, she's not responding. The patient has been clinically dead for 3 minutes. But there's something strange." "What?" Richard almost shouted. "The monitors. Every time we try to stop resuscitation, they start registering activity again. It's weak, intermittent, but it's as if something is keeping her here. Something we can't explain." Richard didn't wait for authorization. He pushed through the doors. He entered the emergency room, and what he saw made him stop in his tracks. Emily was lying on the gurney, pale as marble. Tubes and wires connected to her body. The doctors around her, exhausted, confused. But it was something else that seized Richard's attention. On Emily's back, where her gown had been cut away for the medical procedures, there was a mark, and a birthmark, in the shape of a star, exactly where, in Richard's dreams, a bullet had entered. In the dreams he'd had since childhood, in the dreams where a woman died in his arms, wearing a dress from another era, whispering a promise he could never quite hear completely. Richard walked to the gurney, as if hypnotized. The doctors tried to stop him. Someone said he couldn't be there, but no one could stop him. He took Emily's hand, and at that moment, when his fingers touched her cold fingers, the heart monitor did something impossible. After 4 minutes of a flatline, it started registering activity again. Weak, irregular, but present. Emily Carter, who had been clinically dead, gave the first sign of life. And Richard Sterling, the billionaire who didn't believe in anything but numbers and contracts, whispered words he didn't know he knew. "Not again. Please. Not this time." He didn't know why he said it, didn't know where those words came from, but as he spoke them, Emily's monitor jumped again, as if she had heard, as if she were fighting to come back, as if 200 years of waiting were about to end. The chief physician looked at Richard with an expression that blended scientific shock and something he couldn't quite define. "Sir, you should leave," he said. This isn't normal." Richard didn't move. "I'm not leaving her," he replied. "Not this time." And once again, without knowing why, He'd said those words. Not this time. As if there had been other times. As if this had happened before. At the emergency room entrance, Mrs. Eleanor was weeping silently, in her lap. Little Lily slept with an expression strangely serene for a child whose mother was dying. And on the little girl's lips, words murmured in her sleep. Daddy came. This time he came in time. No one heard, no one, except Eleanor, who wept even more. Because she knew what that family had waited for 200 years, knew what the story of the great-great-grandfather really meant, and knew that that night, in that hospital, the destiny of two souls was about to change forever. The monitors continued beeping, weak, irregular, but alive. Emily Carter was fighting to come back, and Richard Sterling, without knowing how or why, was holding the line that kept her connected to this world. A line woven 200 years ago, a line that not even death could cut. At least, not completely. At least, not this time. If you believe that some connections go beyond time, beyond reason, beyond everything that science can explain, then stay with me. Because what happened in the next few hours in that hospital would change everything Richard Sterling thought he knew about life, death, and love. He was about to discover that some promises cross centuries, and that some souls simply refuse to stop finding each other, no matter how many lives it takes her, no matter how many deaths, no matter how much time. The clock read 4:16 p.m. Emily Carter had been technically dead for 25 minutes, and yet, somehow impossibly, her heart insisted on beating, one beep at a time, as if waiting for something or someone. And Richard Sterling, holding her cold hand, had no intention of letting go. The next 3 hours were the longest of Richard's life. Emily remained in a coma. The doctors couldn't explain how she was still alive. Her heart had stopped for almost 30 minutes. By medical logic, there should have been irreversible brain damage. By medical logic, she shouldn't have come back. But Emily Carter never followed logic. Richard stayed by her side the entire time. The doctors gave up trying to remove him. There was something in his eyes that made them recoil. Something fierce, something ancient, something that didn't belong in this century. As night fell over New York City, Mrs. Eleanor finally had the chance to tell her story. She sat next to Richard, with Lily still sleeping in her lap, and began to speak in a low voice. "Your great-great-grandfather told me this when I was just a girl," she said. "I was 12 years old and working in the kitchen of the Sterling estate. Mr. Edward was old, close to 90. He knew he was going to die soon, and he needed to tell someone." Richard didn't take his eyes off Emily, but he listened to every word. "He said the Sterling family carried a curse," Eleanor continued, "or a blessing, depending on how you look at it. A story that began in 1820, during the American Independence War." Richard felt that chill again. The same sensation he had when he touched Emily. The same sensation he had in his dreams. "Your great-great-grandfather was named Richard, just like you. He was a poor revolutionary, a soldier with no family, no money, no future. He fought for independence because he had nothing to lose." She paused. "Until he met Emily." Richard finally turned his head. "Emily," he repeated. "The same name." Eleanor nodded. Emily was the daughter of the British governor of the region, one of the richest and most powerful women in colonial America. She shouldn't even look at a man like Richard, but she did. And when she did, something happened. What happened? The impossible. They fell in love. A forbidden love. A love that made no sense in any logic of the time. The poor revolutionary and the governor's daughter. The rebel and the princess. They met in secret, exchanged letters, made plans. Eleanor looked at Emily in the bed. Until Richard was captured. The old woman's voice trembled. He was sentenced to death. Execution by firing squad. On the morning they were going to kill him, Emily appeared. No one knows how she found out. No one knows how she arrived in time. But she was there, at the gates of the prison, begging for his life. Richard felt tears in his eyes, tears he didn't understand. What happened? The soldiers didn't care. The orders were clear. Richard was taken to the wall. Emily tried to stop them. She shouted and begged, offered money, offered her own life in exchange. Eleanor closed her eyes. When the soldiers raised their weapons, Emily threw herself in front of him. Richard stopped breathing. The bullet that was meant for him had hit her. In the back. Exactly where? Exactly where Emily has the birthmark, Richard finished, his voice breaking. Mrs. Eleanor nodded, tears streaming down her aged face. She died in his arms, in that plaza, surrounded by soldiers. And before she passed, she made a promise. What promise? Mrs. Eleanor glanced at Lily, who was sleeping soundly. In every life, I will find you. And in every life, I will die for you until we can live together. The words echoed in the silent hospital room. Richard felt something break inside him. Or perhaps something rebuilding itself. He couldn't quite tell which. Are you telling me? This has happened before? Mrs. Eleanor nodded slowly. Many times. Your great-grandfather researched it extensively. He found records. In every generation of the Sterling family, there was a man named Richard. And in every generation, a woman appeared. A woman with the mark on her back. A woman who died far too soon. Richard stared at Emily, his mind reeling. And this time, Mrs. Eleanor gently took his hand. This time, you arrived in time. For the first time in 200 years gone, you arrived in time. Richard couldn't quite process it all. It was madness, impossible. It defied everything he believed in. But then, why did it make so much sense? Why had he dreamed of this woman since he was a child? Why did he feel that inexplicable connection the moment he saw Emily? Why did he say those words in the ambulance? Words that didn't feel like his own. Words from another time? And why? When he looked at the mark on Emily's back, did he feel a pain so profound it felt like it was tearing his soul apart? It's not coincidence, he murmured. None of this is coincidence. Mrs. Eleanor shook her head solemnly. It never was. Richard stood up abruptly. His legs trembled. But he needed to see. He needed to find proof. What else did your great-grandfather find? Were there documents? Was there anything? Yes, there's a safe in the Sterling estate. In your grandfather's study. Mr. Edward placed everything in there before he died. He said it would be needed someday. Richard grabbed his cell phone immediately. Have that safe opened, now, and bring everything that's inside here. Half an hour later, a staff member from the Sterling estate arrived at the hospital, carrying an antique mahogany box. Richard opened it with trembling hands, and what he saw inside changed his life forever. A portrait, painted in oil, dated 1819. A woman in an elegant dress, dark hair, profound eyes. Emily Carter's face. Identical. Exactly identical. Down to the small birthmark that the painter had included on her neck. Richard dropped the portrait. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely hold it. It's impossible, he whispered, his voice barely audible. There were other things in the box. Letters yellowed with age, a diary, a silver ring with an inscription, and a document, old, fragile, almost disintegrating at the edges. A marriage certificate. Richard Sterling and Emily Maria del Carmen Fuentes, married in secret, 2 weeks before the execution. The date was January of 1820, exactly 200 years before the month that Emily Carter was hired to work at the Sterling estate. Richard sank heavily into the chair. "We were married," he said, his voice sounding as if it was coming from another world. "We were married, and I didn't know." Mrs. Eleanor glanced over at Emily, still lying unconscious in the hospital bed. "She didn't know either, but your souls knew. Your souls never forgot." Richard opened the diary. The pages were fragile, but still legible. It was a woman's handwriting, elegant, refined. He read the first entry, his heart pounding in his chest. "Today I met a man who will change my life. He is poor and revolutionary, and he should be my enemy. But when I looked into his eyes, I saw eternity. I saw all the lives we have already lived together. I saw all the lives we still will live." My soul recognized him before my mind knew his name. Richard closed the diary abruptly, his hand shaking. Tears streamed freely down his face. "She knew," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "From the first moment, she knew." "And in every life," Mrs. Eleanor said softly, "she returned, searching, hoping, fulfilling the promise." "What promise?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The promise to die for you, until you could finally live together." Richard gazed at Emily in the hospital bed, his heart aching with an indescribable mix of love, grief, and disbelief. "She died today," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "But she's still here." "Mrs." Eleanor responded softly. "I held on to her. I didn't let go." "Perhaps that's it," Mercedes said. "Perhaps this time, love will be stronger than the promise." Richard reached out and took Emily's hand again. And at that moment, when his fingers touched hers, something extraordinary happened. The monitors started beeping faster, the rhythm growing increasingly erratic. The nurse rushed over to check, her eyes widening with disbelief. "She's waking up," she shouted, her voice filled with shock and elation. "Call the doctor. She's waking up." Richard felt his heart pound in his chest, his breath catching in his throat. "Emily," he whispered. Her eyes began to move beneath her closed eyelids. A faint flicker of consciousness, her lips parted slightly. And the sound that came out was impossible. It was Spanish, but not modern Spanish. It was an ancient dialect, colonial, extinct for more than 100 years. And she was saying something, repeating it over and over, as if she were in a dream. "I have found you. After so long, I have found you." The doctors rushed in, pushing past Richard and Mrs. Eleanor. "Stand back. We need to examine her." But Richard refused to let go of her hand, his grip firm and unwavering. And when Emily finally opened her eyes, she didn't look at the doctors. She didn't look at the machines. She looked directly at Richard. And she said, in perfect 19th century Spanish, words that he knew from his dreams, "Cumplí mi promesa, mi amor, te encontré." I fulfilled my promise, my love. I found you. The doctor froze, his eyes wide with disbelief. The nurse dropped her clipboard, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. And Richard Sterling, the billionaire who didn't believe in anything beyond the material world, responded in a language he had never studied, a language that seemed to flow from his very soul. "Yo también te encontré, mi reina, y esta vez no te dejaré ir." I found you too, my queen, and this time I will not let you go. When he realized what he had said, he understood it wasn't him speaking. It was someone else, from another time, from another life. And Emily, lying in that hospital bed with tubes and wires connected to her body, smiled. The same smile from the portrait of 1819, a beacon of hope and recognition. The same smile from Richard's dreams, a symbol of their enduring connection. The same smile from 200 years ago, a testament to the timeless power of love. "You came," she said, her voice weak but firm. "This time, you came in time." Richard felt tears stream down his face, his heart overflowing with emotion. "This time I came," he responded, his voice thick with emotion. "And I'm never leaving again." At the door of the room, Mrs. Eleanor wept, tears of joy streaming down her face, and in her arms, little Lily woke up. The little girl looked at her mother, then at Richard, a knowing look on her face, and she said, with the naturalness of a child who knows things that adults have forgotten, "You finally remembered. I always knew you would remember." No one understood, no one except Mrs. Eleanor, who saw in Lily's eyes the same ancient light that shone in Emily's eyes, and knew, at that moment, that this family had many more stories to tell. Stories of 200 years, stories of souls that refuse to be separated, stories of love that even death cannot destroy. The clock read 9:37 p.m. Emily Carter had returned from the dead, and the world would never be the same, and Richard Sterling finally understood why he'd been waiting his entire life. He was waiting for her, just as she was waiting for him. 200 years, through countless lives, through countless deaths, until finally, on that ordinary Tuesday in November, their souls found each other again, and this time, neither of them had any intention of letting go. If you're feeling chills right now, leave a comment down below, because what's coming next will make all of this seem like just the beginning. Because Emily Carter had more than memories to reveal. She had proof. Proof that would challenge everything Richard thought he knew about the world and about himself. The following hours were a whirlwind of emotions, memories, and revelations that no one in that hospital would ever forget. Emily was awake, physically weak, but mentally present, in a way that frightened the doctors. She had no brain damage. She had no after effects. She was perfectly lucid, and she remembered everything, not just this life, but all of them. When the doctors finally left the room, Emily looked at Richard with eyes that carried centuries of memory. "You want to know," she said. "You want to understand?" Richard nodded. The words wouldn't come. "Then give me your hand," she said softly. "And I'll show you." Richard hesitated. The last time he touched her hand, something impossible had happened. But then he looked into Emily's eyes and saw something he recognized, something his soul knew, even if his mind didn't understand. He reached out his hand, their fingers intertwined, and the world disappeared. Richard was no longer in the hospital. He was in a square, an old square, colonial, surrounded by buildings from another era. The sun was rising. There were soldiers everywhere, and in the center of the square, a man tied to a post, himself, or rather, a version of him from another time. Richard saw his own face from 200 years ago, dirty, wounded, but with eyes that burned with determination. Around him, Spanish soldiers prepared their rifles. An execution. He was about to witness his own death. But then he heard a scream. Emily. She was running towards him, dressed as a noblewoman, hair loose, tears streaming down her face. The guards tried to hold her back, but she broke free. "No, please, take me, kill me, he's done nothing." The commander ignored her. "Prepare." The soldiers raised their weapons. Emily ran faster. "Aim." She was almost there. "Fire." And then, in the last second, Emily threw herself in front of Richard. The bullet hit her in the back, exactly where the birthmark would be. Richard felt the impact as if it were in his own body. Saw Emily fall into his arms, saw the blood, saw the life slowly leaving her eyes, and heard the words she whispered. "In every life, I will find you, And in every life, I will die for you. Until we can live together. I promise. My love, I promise. Richard from 200 years ago screamed. A scream that tore through time, a scream that echoed through centuries, and Richard from the present, watching that scene, felt tears streaming down a face that was no longer in the hospital. He was there, in 1820, holding Emily's body as she died. "I've seen this," he whispered. "In dreams. My whole life. I've seen this." The vision shifted. Now he was somewhere else. Another time, decades later. A woman worked in a factory. Dark hair, deep eyes. Emily, another version of her. And across the factory floor, a man watched her. Himself. Another version. They met in secret. Even though they were from different classes. Even though they knew it was forbidden. And then a fire, the factory catching fire. Emily saving children as the roof collapsed. She died in that fire. He arrived too late. The vision shifted again. Decades later, another life. Emily was a nurse in a war. Richard was a wounded soldier. She cared for him for weeks. They fell in love. And when a bomb hit the hospital, Emily covered his body with hers. She died. He survived. The vision shifted once more. Life after life. Death after death. Always her dying for him. Always him arriving late. Always the promise being kept, but never completed. In every life I will find you, and in every life I will die for you, until we can live together. Richard saw decades pass like seconds, saw different faces, but the same soul, saw clothes from different eras, but the same love, saw history repeating itself, time and time again, until the vision stopped, in the present, in the hospital, where Emily Carter lay clinically dead, and where Richard Sterling, for the first time in 200 years, arrived in time, didn't let go, held her hand, and brought her back. Richard opened his eyes. He was back in the hospital room, his hand still intertwined with Emily's. Tears streamed down his face. His heart beat so hard it hurt. "You saw," Emily said softly. "I saw everything. Now you understand." Richard couldn't speak. The emotions were too much. He embraced her as if he had waited 200 years for that moment, because he had. "Forgive me," he whispered, "for all the times I arrived late, for all the times I couldn't save you." Emily caressed his face. "You don't have to ask for forgiveness. It was my promise. I chose to die for you. In every life, until we could live together. But now you saved me, that's for the first time. You saved me." She smiled. "The cycle can finally end." Richard looked into her eyes. "I'm not going to lose you again. Never again. I swear." Emily squeezed his hand. "I know. I always knew that one day. You would come in time." Across the room, a sound made them both turn. Lily was awake, sitting in the chair next to Mrs. Eleanor, and her eyes shone with the same ancient light. That shone in Emily's eyes. "I remember too," the girl said. "I remember everything." Emily felt her heart race. "My daughter." Lily walked to the bed. Her steps were small, but firm. "You were my mommy in 1822, she said. "And you, Richard, were my daddy. We were a family, before the soldiers came." Richard looked at Emily, the vision he had, the face of the woman who died in his arms. She was pregnant. He hadn't realized it before, but now he saw it clearly. The bullet that killed Emily in 1820 didn't just kill her, it killed their daughter too. The daughter who was now there, reborn, waiting for her parents to finally remember. Richard felt something break and rebuild inside him, all at the same time. "Lily," he whispered. The little girl smiled. "You finally remembered, Daddy." She called him Daddy. And this time, it wasn't a mistake. It was a 200-year-old truth, finally acknowledged. Richard knelt beside the bed. He looked at Emily. He looked at Lily, his family, the family he had been searching for 2 centuries, without even knowing it. The family that had been tragically separated in another era. The family that was, finally, reunited. Emily was crying. Lily was smiling. And Richard was feeling a peace he'd never experienced before. A peace that came from finally understanding, finally remembering, finally finding. "We were a family," Emily said, her voice breaking. "And we're going to be again." Richard held Lily's hand with his left, and Emily's hand with his right. "This time," he promised, "no one will separate us." Mrs. Eleanor, who had been watching everything from the doorway, finally spoke. "There's one more thing," she said. "Something you need to see." She walked over to the mahogany box that was still in the room and took out an object that Richard hadn't noticed before, a small baby shoe, embroidered with initials, L.S. Lily Sterling, the same Lily, who was now standing there, 4 years old, looking at the shoe with eyes that knew. "It was mine," she said simply. "You gave it to me the day I was born. Daddy, before the soldiers came." Richard took the shoe. It was so small, so fragile, so old. And yet, somehow, impossibly, it had survived 200 years. "Your great-grandfather kept it," Mrs. Eleanor explained, "along with all the other objects. He knew they would be needed one day." Richard looked at the shoe, then at Lily, then at Emily. 200 years, 200 years of waiting, 200 years of deaths, 200 years of promises. And finally, on that ordinary Tuesday in November, in a hospital room, everything made sense. He wasn't just a billionaire. Emily wasn't just a housekeeper. Lily wasn't just a child. They were a family. They always had been. In every life, in every time. And now, finally, they were together. If you've made it this far, if you're feeling the weight of this story in your chest, comment below which part moved you the most, because what happened in the following hours, in that hospital, was even more impossible. Emily had one last revelation, a revelation that would change everything, a revelation about how to break the cycle, once and for all. And Richard Sterling, for the first time in his life, was ready to believe in the impossible, because the impossible was his family, and he wasn't willing to lose them, ever again. The night wore on in the hospital. The doctors still couldn't explain Emily's miraculous recovery. The tests didn't make sense. A woman who had been clinically dead for almost 30 minutes should have severe brain damage, should have cognitive problems, should barely be able to speak. But Emily was perfectly lucid, more than lucid. She was remembering things that shouldn't be possible to remember. When the doctors finally left them alone, she looked at Richard with a serious expression. "There's something you need to understand," she said, "about the promise and about the cycle." Richard nodded. "When I made that promise, in 1820, I didn't know what I was doing. I was dying. I was desperate. I just wanted to find you again." Emily paused. "But promises made on the threshold of death have power. More power than I imagined." "What do you mean?" "I conditioned myself to die for you, in every life. It was the only way I knew how to fulfill the promise. Die for you, until we could live together." But I never got to the second part, because I always died first. Richard felt a chill. It was a cycle, Emily continued, a cycle that I created myself, and that I perpetuated for 200 years. But this time, it was different. Yes, Maid, this time, you held me. You didn't let me go. For the first time, love was stronger than death. For the first time, you arrived in time. So the cycle is over? Emily hesitated, almost. What's missing? She looked at the birthmark on her back. Still visible. Still there. As long as that mark exists, the cycle is still active. I'm still tied to that promise. Still doomed to die for you. Richard felt his blood run cold. So, what do we do? Emily took his hand. You need to free me from the promise. You need to tell me that you don't want me to die for you. You need to choose me, alive. That seems so simple. But it isn't, because you need to really believe it, need to really want it, need to really choose to have me alive, instead of having my death as proof of love. Richard looked into her eyes. He understood now. Emily's promise wasn't just about dying for him. It was about proving love, through sacrifice, and to break the cycle. Richard needed to refuse the sacrifice, needed to say that love doesn't need death in to be real, needed to choose life. I love you, he said, and his voice was firm. I loved you in 1820. I loved you in every life we found each other. I loved you, even without knowing who you were. He held her face between his hands. But I don't want your death as proof. I don't want your sacrifice. I want you, alive, here, with me, with Lily, as a family. Emily felt tears streaming down her face. And I release you from your promise, Richard continued. I release you from the cycle. I choose you alive. I choose you present. I choose you forever. When he finished speaking, something happened, something that neither of them would ever forget. The birthmark on Emily's back began to glow, a golden light, soft, warm, and then, slowly, it began to disappear. Richard looked on, in disbelief. The mark that had been there, Emily's entire life. The mark that represented the bullet that killed her in 1820, the mark that was the physical proof of the promise, was fading. Emily felt a tingling on her back. It didn't hurt. It was almost liberating. It's working, she whispered. It's really working. The light intensified for a moment, and then it disappeared. And with it, the mark. Richard touched Emily's back. Smooth skin, no mark, no scar, nothing. It's gone, he said, his voice filled with awe. The mark is gone. Emily was crying, but they were tears of joy. The cycle is over, she said. 200 years. It's finally over. She hugged him, and this time, there was no weight of promise, no shadow of death. There was only love. Love free. Love alive. A love that could finally exist without sacrifice. In the chair beside him, Lily slept soundly once more, but in her dreams, she smiled because she felt it too. The family was finally free, free to live, free to love, free to be what they were always meant to be. 200 years ago. The clock struck 3 in the morning when Richard finally understood everything. He understood why he had been born wealthy in this life. He understood why Emily had been born into more humble circumstances. He understood why their paths had crossed as employer and employee. The universe was testing them. In 1820, she was rich, and he was poor. She sacrificed herself for him. Now, the positions were reversed, and the question was, Would he sacrifice for her, not in death, but in life? Would he give up his social standing, his expectations, everything the world expected of a billionaire, for a housekeeper, for a single mother, for a woman the world would say was not for him? Richard looked at Emily sleeping, and he knew, in that moment, that his answer was yes, yes forever, yes without hesitation, yes with his whole being. Because she wasn't just a housekeeper, she was his eternity. And no social barrier, no expectation, no judgment was worth more than 200 years of love, waiting to finally be lived. The following days were the most intense of Richard's life. Emily was discharged from the hospital a week later. The doctors still couldn't explain her recovery. They called it a medical miracle, a statistical anomaly, an inexplicable phenomenon. They didn't know the real miracle had happened 200 years ago, in a colonial square, when a woman died with a promise on her lips. Richard took Emily and Lily to the Sterling estate, not as a housekeeper, but as family. The staff were shocked. The business partners were outraged. The press went into a frenzy. New York billionaire takes up relationship with former housekeeper. The headlines were cruel. The social media was worse, but Richard didn't care. For the first time in his life, he understood what really mattered. And it wasn't business. It wasn't money. It wasn't status. It was love. Love that had survived 200 years of separation. Love that had crossed deaths and rebirths. Love that finally, after so much waiting, could be lived in peace. A week after Emily was discharged, Richard did something that surprised everyone. He took her to the same studio where the 1819 portrait had been painted. The studio still existed. It was now an art gallery. And when Richard explained what he wanted, the owner of the gallery was moved. "You want me to paint a new portrait?" he said. "To commemorate the continuation of the story." Richard nodded, but this time with the whole family. 3 weeks later, the portrait was finished. Emily, Richard, and Lily, together, smiling, alive. The painter had placed the old portrait in the background of the composition, like a shadow, a memory, an honor to the past. But the focus was the present. 3 people who had finally found each other, 3 souls who had finally completed the cycle, 3 hearts who had finally found peace. Richard hung the new portrait next to the old one in the study of the Sterling estate. 200 years of difference, but the same love. Mrs. Eleanor, who had witnessed everything, finally told her own story. "I have memories too," she said one night, as the family dined. "Memories of other lives, of other eras." Richard looked at her surprised. "You too?" Mrs. Eleanor nodded. "I was Lily's nanny in 1820. I was there when the soldiers came. I tried to protect her, but I couldn't. And when I died in that life, I made my own promise." "What promise?" "I promised I would find that family again, and that this time, I would help bring you together." Emily held the old housekeeper's hand. "And you did," she said. "You found us. You kept the secrets. You maintained everything until we were ready." Mrs. Eleanor smiled with tears in her eyes. 50 years, she said. 50 years working for the Sterling family. Waiting, watching, praying for the day that you would finally remember. Lily, who listened to everything with her wise eyes of an ancient child, got up from her chair and hugged Mrs. Eleanor. "Thank you, Grandma Eleanor, for waiting for us." The old housekeeper wept. It was the first time someone had called her grandma, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. 2 months later, Richard made a decision. He organized a ceremony in the same square where, 200 years before, everything had ended in tragedy. The square had changed. It was now a public park. But the old stones were still there. The centuries-old trees still provided shade, and the energy of the place still carried memories of another time. Richard, Emily, and Lily were in the center of the park. Around them, only the people who mattered. Mrs. Eleanor. Some loyal employees. No one from the press. No one from the outside. Richard held Emily's hands. 200 years ago, he began, in this very place, we were separated by death. You died in my arms with a promise on your lips, and I spent centuries trying to find you. Emily was crying. But now, Richard continued, the cycle is over. The promise has been fulfilled, and I have a new promise to make. He took a ring from his pocket. It wasn't the silver ring of 1820. That was kept in the mahogany box. As a relic, it was a new ring, modern, but with an ancient inscription. Forever, in every life. Emily Carter, Richard said, will you marry me? Not because destiny brought us together, not because our souls recognize each other, but because I choose you. Today, tomorrow, and in all the lives we will still live together. Emily couldn't speak. The tears wouldn't let her. But she nodded. And when Richard put the ring on her finger, something magical happened. The wind blew softly through the park. The leaves of the trees danced. And for a brief moment, for an instant that lasted less than a breath, everyone there felt it. They felt the presence of other eras. They felt the weight of 200 years being finally released. They felt the joy of souls who had finally found their place. Lily, holding Mrs. Eleanor's hand, smiled. They're here, she whispered. All the versions of them, from all the lives. They're here, watching, finally at peace. Mrs. Eleanor nodded. She felt it too. 6 months later, Emily and Richard were officially married, not in a grandiose ceremony for the press, in a small ceremony, intimate and overflowing with meaning. Lily was the bridesmaid, radiant and excited for her sister. Mrs. Eleanor was the matron of honor, beaming with pride. And when the priest asked if anyone had any objections, everyone chuckled softly, because who could object to a love that had waited 200 years? The reception took place at the Sterling estate, in the gardens, under a canopy of stars. And as Richard and Emily danced their first dance as husband and wife, something impossible happened. The music playing was a waltz, an old waltz, from 1820. No one had programmed that music. No one knew where it had come from. But Emily recognized it immediately. It was the music they danced to in another life, in another time, in another world. Richard looked deeply into her eyes, a knowing smile playing on his lips. You remember? I remember everything. They danced, lost in the music, and as they danced, for a brief, ethereal moment, they were no longer Richard Sterling and Emily Carter. They were Richard and Emily from 1820, finally completing the dance that was interrupted 200 years ago, finally living the moment they never had a chance to live, finally together, free, at peace. The guests watched in reverent silence, captivated by the moment. No one fully understood what was happening, but everyone felt it. They felt that this moment was much larger than a simple wedding dance. They felt that this moment was the conclusion of a story that began centuries ago. They felt that this moment was, in a way, sacred. When the music ended, Richard kissed Emily, a tender, passionate kiss, and whispered in her ear the same words he had whispered in 1820. Forever, my love, in every life. Emily smiled, a genuine, radiant smile. Forever, she replied, but this time, in life, and this time, It was true. This time. There would be no premature death. This time. There would be no tragic separation. This time. They would live together, grow old together, and when the time came to depart, they would depart together. No promises of pain, no cycles of suffering, only love, pure, free, eternal. A year later, Emily gave birth to a boy. A perfect, healthy baby boy. Richard held his son in his arms, tears welling in his eyes, a sense of completion washing over him, and when he looked into the baby's face, he saw something familiar, something that stirred deep within his soul. The same eyes as his grandfather, the same eyes as his great-grandfather, the same eyes that the Sterling family had carried for generations. "His name is Edward," Emily said softly, "in honor of your great-grandfather, the man who guarded the secrets for all these years." Richard nodded, tears streaming freely down his face. Edward was perfect, a tiny, precious miracle. And Lily, now 5 years old, looked at her baby brother with adoration, her young heart overflowing with love. "He's new," she said with the innocent wisdom of a child. "His soul is new. He's not part of the cycle." Richard looked at his daughter, puzzled. "What do you mean?" "The cycle was between the three of you," Lily explained, with her ancient child wisdom. "You, Mommy, and me. We needed to find each other again. But Edward is a gift for finally succeeding." Emily embraced her daughter, overwhelmed with emotion. "You are so wise, my little one. I remember a lot of things, Mommy. But now I can start to forget. Now I can just be a kid." And that's exactly what happened. In the following months, Lily slowly began forgetting the memories of past lives, the weight of centuries slowly lifting from her small shoulders, not in a sad way, but in a liberating way. A sense of freedom she had never experienced before. She no longer needed to carry the weight of centuries, the burden of unfulfilled promises and tragic endings. The cycle had ended, the chains of destiny broken. She could finally just be a 5-year-old girl, with parents who loved her unconditionally, with a baby brother to protect and cherish, with a whole lifetime ahead of her, filled with endless possibilities, no ancient promises, no tragic destinies, just future, bright and full of hope. Mrs. Eleanor lived for 3 more years, enjoying every moment with her family. She passed away peacefully in her sleep, with a gentle smile on her face, at home, surrounded by loved ones, the day before. She had told Richard that her mission was complete, her purpose fulfilled. "I found them," she said, her voice weak but filled with joy. "I brought them together. I saw the cycle end. Now I can rest." At the funeral, Richard placed a framed photo of Mrs. Eleanor next to the antique portraits, a testament to her unwavering loyalty and love. She was just as much a part of the story as any of them, and her legacy would live on forever in the Sterling family, a symbol of hope and redemption. 10 years later, Richard and Emily were sitting in the garden of the Sterling estate, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. Enjoying the simple pleasures of life, Lily, now 14 years old, was playfully teasing Edward, who was 9, their laughter echoing through the air. The sun was setting, painting the sky in vibrant hues of orange, pink, and gold, and everything was at peace, a tranquility that had eluded them for so long. "Do you regret anything?" Emily asked, her voice soft and filled with contentment. Richard paused for a moment, lost in thought. "I regret taking so long," he said finally, his eyes filled with sincerity. "I regret fighting what I felt. I regret wasting 6 months pretending you were just the housekeeper, pretending I didn't love you." Emily smiled knowingly, her heart overflowing with love. 6 months out of a lifetime," she replied, "compared to 200 years of waiting. I think we can forgive that. Richard chuckled softly, reaching for her hand. I guess we can. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching their children play, their hearts filled with gratitude and peace. Do you still remember? Emily asked, breaking the silence. The other lives? Richard nodded slowly, his gaze distant. But it's fading, he admitted. Like a dream you know you had, but can no longer see clearly. Emily agreed, a sense of acceptance in her eyes. For me too, and I think that's how it should be. The past needs to stay in the past, so we can truly live in the present. Richard squeezed her hand tightly, his love for her unwavering. I love you, Maid, he said, his voice filled with emotion. Not because of the past, not because of the other lives. I love you because you are you, here, now, in this life. Emily leaned in and kissed him, a kiss that sealed their love, their destiny, their forever. I love you too, she whispered, her eyes sparkling with joy, for who you are, for the father you've become, for the husband you chose to be. The sun finished its descent, dipping below the horizon. The stars began to appear, twinkling like diamonds in the night sky. And somewhere, in a plane that humans cannot see, two souls who had finally found peace smiled. Knowing their journey was complete, the cycle had ended, the karmic debts repaid, love had conquered all, proving its power to transcend time and space, and after 200 years of pain, sacrifice, and waiting, Richard and Emily finally had what they had always wanted: a life together. Simple, ordinary, extraordinary. If you've made it this far, if you felt something with this story, leave a comment sharing your experience. Let me know what resonated with you. Have you ever felt like you knew someone deeply, even though you just met them? Have you ever had dreams about people you've never seen, but who seemed strangely familiar? Have you ever felt a connection that you can't quite explain, a pull that defies logic? Because if you have, maybe it's not a coincidence. Maybe it's not just your imagination running wild. Maybe it's your soul remembering promises made in other lives, vows whispered across time, remembering loves that have traversed centuries, enduring the tests of fate, remembering connections that even death cannot destroy, bonds that are stronger than any earthly force. Some stories are bigger than one lifetime. They unfold across centuries, weaving tapestries of love and loss. Some connections are stronger than time, defying the boundaries of mortality and space. And some loves simply refuse to die. They burn with an eternal flame, illuminating the darkness. No matter how many lives it takes, no matter how many centuries pass, no matter how many obstacles arise, true love always finds a way, a path through the labyrinth of time, just as Richard and Emily found their love a beacon of hope in a world often shrouded in darkness. After 200 years, through countless lives, each one a brushstroke on the canvas of their eternal romance. Through countless deaths, each one a temporary separation that only strengthened their bond, until finally, on an ordinary Tuesday in November, in a hospital in New York City, two soulmates recognized each other, their hearts instantly knowing what their minds had forgotten, their love story, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, a reminder that some connections are simply meant to be, and they finally decided to live together forever, not in death, but in life. This is the story of Richard and Emily, a love story that spanned centuries, a story of promises kept, a story of souls who refused to give up, and a story that, perhaps, reminds you of someone you haven't met yet, or someone you have already met but haven't recognized. Pay attention, because your soul knows. Your soul always knows, and when the time comes, you will remember too.